Hello and welcome to the YouTube podcast series of Cities ABC and Open Business Council, Fashion ABC and Dennis Guarda. I'm Hilton Supra, the Vice Chairman of Student Group, and I'm looking forward to interviewing today David Duffy, who's the co-founder of the Corporate Governance Institute. Here we interview people who are changing the world, people that are inspiring us with their achievements and creativity and acumen, and also with the use of technology. In previous interviews, Dennis Guarda and I have interviewed over 200 amazing people who achieved over 13 million views on YouTube. This interview series on Cities ABC is in partnership with our platforms openbusinesscouncil.org and fashionabc.org, all fourth industrial revolution-based platforms utilizing technologies that employ the use of truth and trust through blockchain and deployment of data analytics, AI, and machine learning. So I'd like to introduce you today to David Duffy. Welcome.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
Brilliant. So where are you at the moment?
I'm in my kitchen in my apartment in Blackrock, County Dublin.
Brilliant. And I'm sitting here, down here in Lisbon. So we're actually on the same time zone.
Which is great.
This is perfect, yes. So a little bit about you, David. I mean, you are one of, your island's leading practitioner, author, educator, and evangelist in all things to do with corporate governance. You've got a lot of experience in terms of strategy consulting in the US, in the UK, Ireland, and Europe. But it all started when you graduated from Trinity College, Dublin, but as a Bachelor of Business Studies, and then you became a chartered accountant. You trained with PwC in London, and you did an MBA in Lausanne at the IMD. You also co-founded the Corporate Governance Institute, really to democratize the education of directors globally by providing accredited and online programs so learners can learn what they want, when they want. And you are really one of the largest providers of qualified company directors globally. So tell me a little bit about, obviously you're based in Dublin, but when you were starting out before you went to Trinity College, what really inspired you to go down this career path?
Well, to be quite honest, I mean, before I went to Trinity, I never heard the word corporate governance, let alone be able to spell it. I was the first member of our family to go to university. My father didn't. He was a baker, and he worked for a big bakery plant. And then when he met my mother, he realized he had to earn more money. So he became an entrepreneur, and that's been in our family genes. So none of my siblings work for anybody else. They've all done something, either in Germany, Australia, or indeed here. So I have four of the siblings who run their own businesses. I just went to Trinity to broaden my mind, and I did business there. I enjoyed it immensely, and I played out of rugby for Trinity. And after Trinity, I actually ended up playing what I call quarter professional rugby in France for 6 months, where they gave me a bicycle and an apartment. And when they wanted, then they said, "Look, you need to get a job, David." They got me a job in the local cheese factory. Unemployment in France was 18% at the time. There was a strike the next day, and they said, "David, you've got to leave." So I went. That's how I ended up in PwC in London about 2 months later.
Mm-hmm. What position were you playing in rugby?
Number 6. I was probably the slowest in Trinity College, but I still got a place. It was great.
I mean, the rugby in France is very, very, very. I'm to be digressing a little bit here, but rugby in France must have been most enjoyable.
It was, but I mean, I remember the first match I played was in a place called Montilly-Mar, which is in the south of France. I was based in Clermont, and the president, a guy called Mr. Piquet, says, "David, do not lie on the ground, otherwise they will kick the shit out of you." And he was right.
Get on your feet.
So I don't know if you might need to edit that. I don't know. Anyway,
no, that's fine.
So it was great fun, and I've been connected with the college ever since. I've been president of the rugby club a couple of times, so I support them. But it's a great network, and like life is about networks. I've learned that from many people. So that's a network I cherish, the PwC one in the UK, the Accenture one. And I've developed my own networks too. So I suppose I ended up I went to business school to leave my chartered accounting background behind because it was kind of hindering my progress. Mm-hmm. And I couldn't really do double entry. It just wasn't me, which is getting your debits and credits right. And that lifted me to a new level of thinking, which is strategy for organizations. And I loved it. It's a great school. I spent a year there. It was very tough, survived. And I now have a global network in most cities in the world you care to think of. And I have access to a database of about 140,000 alumni, including a lot in Argentina. And we had a lot of exchanges over last weekend, of course, with the World Cup. And my colleagues in France who weren't exactly enthralled by the result. But there you go, that's life. So when I was doing the work with Accenture, I ended up in the boardroom a lot because you're selling strategy. It wasn't their core business. IT was their core business then. So I left and started my own company called Prospectus Strategy Consultants. And that was a disruptor. We were the only consulting company in Dublin only doing strategy. The Big Four would have done lots of different things, but we were core strategy. And that was quite successful. But when I started Prospectus and coming to the end, we were doing a lot of work for organizations, doing mergers, acquisitions, sorting out boards. And then eventually I got an opportunity funded by Enterprise Ireland, which is the biggest venture capital company in Europe, to look at a particular organization in a small town outside Dublin for an organization they were going to put a lot of money into. So I was looking for the book on corporate governance. I said, there must be one somewhere here in Ireland, but there wasn't. Anyway, I bluffed it and got away with it and developed a report for them. But I only found out in the bar in that town, I'd done the normal process doing a governance diagnostic, what really went on in the place. So after 3 pints of beer, I realized they were all related to each other. And you just couldn't say, well, you've got to get rid of so-and-so and change that and all the rest of it. It's much more complex. They've gone on to become a successful international financial services organization. So after that, I exited my strategy company about 5 years ago. And I got the opportunity to do a course, an online course in leadership and development, run by the Irish Times here, which is the leading kind of business newspaper. Mm-hmm. And it was run by a guy from Harvard and McKinsey. And it was online for 9 months, an hour a week. I came back one day and I said, is anybody doing this in corporate governance? So I took 2 weeks off work, Googled and found nothing online. Nobody's doing anything. It was all face-to-face. And there's, you've got the elite business schools, you've got a lot of professional organizations in South Africa, UK, Australia, all doing great things, but they're very local. And, you have to get in your car to go and benefit from the education. And I thought there's an opportunity here for a disruptor to actually develop a platform and produce directors that had a global orientation. So our mantra, our mission is to democratize the educator and directors, because currently you can pay an awful lot of money for going to one of our competitor courses. Our price point, we're not cheap, but our price point is much lower. So it's more available to people to do the course from their car. Even we've had people doing it from their office, and we've had people from Japan to Vietnam, to Singapore, to Middle East, Egypt, South Africa. 40 countries now are now doing it online. So far, we've had, I think, about 360 have completed it. 360 are doing it currently, and about another 600 will do it next year. So it's gone quite well in the 40 countries, as I said.
Wow. I mean, one of the interesting things about corporate governance and directors, they all obviously, corporate law is not necessarily universal. It's subject to local environments. But I think the principles of corporate governance transcend jurisdictions. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, one of the challenges we got actually when we were trying to raise money for the Corporate Governance Institute was how can you possibly develop a program that doesn't recognize local company law and other requirements that a director might have. So, for example, if a company is in a regulated sector like financial services or healthcare, they are regulated and there is a code of governance. So we said, well, that's not our job here. Our job is to make sure that if you want to go on a board in Lisbon or in Singapore or Vietnam, what is the company law? Is it regulated? And what are my obligations as a director? That's what we teach. And that's like 5% of it. The rest of it is actually kind of good corporate governance principles, like developing the architecture. It's like building a house, how many windows, south-facing back garden, and all that type of stuff. But it should be proportionate to the organization. So you don't want a sledgehammer to crack a nut. Then you talk about the role of the director, their fiduciary duties, culture, strategy, risk, evaluation, board performance, and then finally, how do you get a job as a non-exec director? So that's what we try and help people to do.
Oh, so through the platform, the directors who pass through and get the certificate if there's having successfully completed one of the courses, that they are able to be or available to a plethora of opportunities out there.
Yeah, so we have a membership base. It's not big. We've just recruited a head of membership to try and get to 100,000 members in the next 5 years, which is ambitious, but we think it's possible because there's no one organization in the world developing a global membership. So you can imagine the opportunity if you're based in Lisbon and you understand business in Portugal, but they want to export into Spain or France. We can connect people doing that through this platform. Now, it's early days. I suppose the other thing is that in our research to set up the Institute, now it's based purely on Ireland and the UK, less than 1% of directors who sit on boards have a recognised qualification. So it's an enormous market. And I suspect it's the same everywhere else in the world, but I don't know that for a fact. But we did really detailed research. So it's less than 1%.
Wow. So what sort of accreditation do you have attached to the courses that you're doing? With some authorized?
Yeah. So it's Glasgow Caledonian University, and they specialize in workplace learning. So online is where they want to be, and they've credit rated is the term, our diploma in corporate governance, and more recently we produced a diploma in ESG, which is also credit rated and also online. And people are knocking on our doors about 15 months ago saying, do you have anything in ESG? We said no. So we developed a certificate to give people something. It took 3 hours. And then we developed the diploma, which was released in October. And it's our fastest selling product in the last 3 months. It's just amazing, the demand for it. From not just at director level, but actually at an executive level, because for organizations who don't know about ESG, they're probably going to say, well, the CEO needs to appoint somebody to begin to look at it. And they might even develop an ESG committee of the board to begin to understand what are the implications for them. Because if you take, say, somebody in construction versus somebody in agriculture, ESG and how they approach it is going to be really quite different. And the data you need in relation to what's going on in construction or agriculture will be quite different.
I mean, ESG is a very interesting area. In particular, it's now becoming, like in Europe, a European directive, and in the UK, that companies have to now consider ESG aspects within their annual reporting.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's like a tsunami. I mean, in terms of certainly on the demand side, but also the UK and the EU have brought in legislation that you have to treat it much more seriously. So if my mother was still alive, I would say, she asked me what is ESG, I would say the E bit is, at a minimum, do no harm to the planet and hopefully do some good to the planet. And the same with S, which is the people. So there was an organization called the Business Roundtable in the USA, started in 2019. The first chair, I think, was Jamie Dimon of JP Morgan. And there was 180 CEOs of listed companies in the US. They said we need to look beyond the quarterly bottom line. And they moved into sort of purpose. And in essence, they got into ESG land and saying we should look after people, we should look after the planet. And now we've had a plethora of legislation, certainly in the EU and the UK, less so in the USA. They have a bit of catching up to do, I think, in terms of what organizations should be thinking about. So, I mean, the recent EU legislation is now saying you need to report on sustainability alongside the financial reporting. So it's going to be interesting to see what that looks like, in an annual report. Will ESG reporting have the same prominence as the financial reporting, or not? Or is it going to be tucked in at the back? Or do they have people actually who know how to collect the data against whatever their ESG objectives are, and then reporting that data? And the other interesting thing is, you're familiar with Standard & Poor's and places like that. There are now ESG rating agencies out there who rate ESG reporting, and they're all kind of the early stage. They're still learning their trade. You can get quite different ratings from different agencies, whereas on the credit rating side, they're broadly the same because they're more mature. So it's new world stuff at the moment.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the interesting things, I think it was 10 years ago, I recall that the King report in South Africa came up with the incorporation of various aspects of sustainability into the annual reporting.
Yeah. I sat on what's called the Published Accounts Awards in Dublin for the Institute of Chartered Accountants, and we were beginning to see sustainability reporting about 3 years ago. But there was no standard, and you didn't know what you're reading. You don't know why they're reporting it. You've no sense of what's the integrity of the data being reported. And we're only now beginning to see, and it's in the UK or the EU legislation, that information will now be audited.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's a big change and a big demand on companies. So I'm sure you've seen organizations, and I won't name them, but they're kind of global tech companies saying we're going to be, carbon free by 2030. And, you go on that board and say, well, what's the pathway to being carbon free by 2030? What information should I be getting from the executive? How do I know it's reliable? Are there any standards here? So if you bring, it's like financial reporting 150 years ago, 100 years ago, where there were no standards. And now suddenly all the sustainability bit will now need to abide by these standards. And of course, the overhead that goes with them. So how many sustainability auditors are there in the world? I suspect not that many.
No, with these sort of things, there's a great opportunity for people to embrace that. But at the end of the day, there has to be some form of global standard that means that you can compare one company with another in terms of their ESG compliance, their ESG objectives, and the way that they report that, as we have various standards in terms of reporting generally. Absolutely.
And that's what the standards are about, is to try and bring something to that. And it'll take a while to evolve. I mean, when I was doing chartered accounting, many moons ago, there weren't that many standards, and now there's, enough to wallpaper, a cathedral, pretty much, excuse me. But I think the whole thing about corporate governance, whether it's corporate governance of ESG or the corporate governance as we understand it today, is to take ambiguity away, because ambiguity is kind of the enemy of good governance. So it's less grey and more black and white. It'll never be perfect, and every organization's on a different journey. I do a lot of board evaluations, both here in the UK and Europe, and every organization, it's like a family. They come from a different place, and no board's perfect, as no family's perfect. And you learn a lot about their culture and what's important to them and what they have to change.
No, but if you look, that's a very interesting aspect, because culture is quite important. I've looked at the structure of boards in the Scandinavian region. Have the the supervisory board structures and corporates that you have in, say, the Netherlands, etc., in Germany, etc. So there are different aspects, and culture does take a strong role.
In that. So what we've done to try and understand that, we put in place a governance advisory council who are advisory to the organization, and they come from Australia, Canada, the Netherlands, UK, Middle East, and various other places. And they give us an insight into culture in the Middle East. So we have a lot of customers in the Middle East because we have a great partner down there in Dubai. We also distribute the product through partners. We've got 3 in the UK, 1 in Malta, and 1 in the Middle East, and one in Holland now. But one of the things that's interesting about doing business in these countries, I'm sure big multinationals know this, and we're a very, very small multinational, is, when you have a kind of a learning support line, dealing with people living in the Middle East versus dealing with people in the north of England, it's very different. And we're just beginning to learn that at the moment, to learn the language, to learn how we support them, to make sure they get through the diploma, because we want everybody to pass, whether it's ESG, one of the corporate governance ones. So that's part and parcel of understanding that culture, and that's why our advisory board is in place, and they are invaluable people that we have there who all have some insight into the culture in the US or Canada or wherever.
Mm. Do you think that culture tends to go along? I mean, like this, there's this what we call the Anglo-Saxon culture, which is, say, South Africa, UK nexus, and then you have the US culture. Is it very similar in terms of how boards are run? And then you look at, say, the European culture, running boards in France or running boards in Germany. Give us some of the examples of your experiences in terms of how culture has impacted on the decision-making process within boards and governance. Well,
I think you need to go back to structure as well. So in the US, it's not unusual for the CEO to be also the chair. They call him the president of the organization. So Wells Fargo, which is a great case study in not great corporate governance, where they asked the retail staff to sell a product called Mr. Motivator, and there was basically mis-selling to people who didn't want to buy it. So they had a whistleblowing line for staff. Nobody listened to it. And then one of the staff members went to the New York Times and said, look, they've been mis-selling this. And the CEO ended up in front of Congress for this huge scandal. He got fired. And then they appointed the CFO to be the new CEO, who's still the president. So you have the CEO reporting to himself, which is not great governance. So the US is a bit behind, I think, structurally, how organizations should be run, and separating out the executive from the board.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And in the Netherlands and Germany, you've got the 2-tier system. You've got the supervisory board and the executive board, which is not dissimilar to a board of directors and the executive reporting into it. But it does take into consideration a wider range of stakeholders. So you have, worker representatives on the supervisory board in Holland and Germany, whereas the Anglo model is the board of directors and the executive reporting into it, albeit some of the executive will be on the board, like the CEO or the CFO, depending on the scale of the organization. And in the Middle East, they're still, trying to figure out how they bring some of these disciplines to bear. And I was actually there in Dubai 2 weeks ago doing a governance masterclass. And the big challenge there, a lot of the large organizations are family owned.
Yes.
So, that's a different approach to corporate governance. That's about, long-term succession planning. And the Italians have that too. I mean, Gucci, or Versace. I mean, the family's been involved in those for an awful long time, with all sorts of succession issues and other interesting things that went on in those organizations. So a key part of doing, like, educating people, like we're trying to do, is if they're going on a board, find out what it feels like to be in the boardroom. What is the culture of that boardroom? And I would say to people, talk to the chair, talk to the current non-exec directors and the executive directors, but more importantly, talk to former directors and former senior executives to try and find out what it's really like, because they're more likely to talk openly than people who are on the board. Yes. Because you don't want to end up in a board that's toxic or that's dysfunctional or just doesn't know what they're doing. I mean, ironically, 2 of our graduates, they're both very experienced guys, have gone onto the boards of NASDAQ companies. And one is a very large one and very well known, but they know nothing about corporate governance in this company. So both our graduates are now trying to get the very basics into these organizations. Now, I've only 2 data points. I don't damn every NASDAQ company in the US about it. That'd be unfair. But it's just, it's interesting that is the case.
Mm-hmm. But if you go out of the sort of the public arena in terms of listed companies, and you go into sort of more the large private companies, the board tends to be constructed and the voice tends to be controlled by those who have the largest shareholding or stake.
Yeah.
How does governance work in that context? How can you disentangle shareholding and voice in the decision-making process?
Well, a question I always we teach is that if you're going to go on a private board, understand around the boardroom table what the equity participation is, so you know who will have the loudest voice and why.
Yes.
The other thing I would say is never be the only non-exec director on a private sector board, because you want somebody else to talk to. Otherwise, you're a loner. And I think you'd need to have some commitment from whoever's the largest shareholding, that they're serious about it, that they have a governance handbook, that they try and rotate non-exec directors, because they probably won't rotate the executive ones because they're probably part of the family.
Mm-hmm.
But in the fullness of time, family organizations bring in professional management because they grow old or they don't have the skills. And they're probably the more successful ones. The ones that aren't that successful don't realize actually that you can't be around the boardroom table for 40 years. But you can be in some organizations.
Mm-hmm.
It does happen. So it's really understanding the boardroom dynamic in family company before you go near it. A friend of mine, he went on the board of a very successful online education company, not in our area, but the major shareholder was a non-exec director, and he said it was an absolute disaster because at the end of the day, everybody looked to the shareholder for decisions, not to the chair.
Okay, that's very interesting. Which is how you break that down. How do you create a positive environment where there's a level of engagement and decision making that breaks that cycle?
Yeah, and I think the more informed family owners will see the longer game as opposed to the shorter one. In fact, in our diploma in corporate governance for the self-paced one, which is online, we've established a case study for a totally dysfunctional company that has the owner who's 76, he can't chair a board. The son sees himself as the next rightful chair. All the non-execs don't see that. They've acquired a lot of companies in the UK and Holland and these sort of places. And the place is a mess. There's suggestions of sexual harassment of the other directors by a leading dominant loudmouth banker and all this sort of stuff. And we pose these questions throughout every module about what we would do. But they're real life ones because I've seen them.
Mm-hmm. So you've created this fictitious company with all these issues, and guided people through the analysis, understanding, and process of how to deal with it.
So, for example, in the risk module, what are the greatest risks do you see with the current board? And you're given 3 or 4 options, and you have to pick one. And we want to make that into kind of a Netflix movie, but it's part of our diploma. So you're just waiting for the next episode to see what happens. And the next edition of our next version of our diploma of corporate governance, we're planning to have live actors in a boardroom and virtual reality to make it more interesting for people looking at it online. So that's kind of January's work to figure out how we do that.
All right. Now this is very interesting because this is sort of an area that we're very much involved in on the technology side. So
yeah. So the virtual reality will be, because I went through a Van Gogh total immersion experience in Dublin recently, and part of that was virtual reality, which I hadn't really experienced before. But there's 600 different types of technology you can use in the boardroom, believe it or not. I only know about a few of them. Zoom is one, obviously. Saved us all during COVID. But there are things like, you can have collaboration tools. So supposing you wanted to narrow a number of options to, a particular business case, have the discussion before you come to the boardroom. So you're down to 2. And then you can discuss that in the boardroom face to face. So there's lots of those collaboration tools. There's also tools that wouldn't be available. It's just supposing you're a chair of an organization. You want feedback. So it's a physical meeting. You've got to go and ask people. But there's anonymous feedback tools you can give to chairs, say how they're doing, which I think is a really positive thing. And they get feedback straight away. Hilton, you're not managing Jane, who is a very dominant director in the room. You need to do something about it, or else I'm resigning. Extreme case. And you have all these portals to store board documentation in, so you're not sending attachments by emails, which is kind of high risk. So there's lots of technology you can use, not just some of the I have been exposed to.
But this is one of the questions I want to ask, and you've touched upon it. I think it's very important is that there's the level of transparency, which creates that level of trust and governance, which requires that there is a body of work that has been done in that decision-making process that can be called upon to make audits and things like that in terms of reporting along ESG lines, for example. But there's no real, as you say, there's many platforms out there that can assist in that process. But I think it's important, as you say, in terms of governance, to put in place a framework which tools can be used to facilitate and achieve certain objectives or certain processes or protocols.
Yeah, so the way I see it happening in the future, most board meetings during COVID were purely online, and now we're going to go to a hybrid model where you don't need to bring people together, for your 8 or 9 or whatever it might be board meetings a year, because that could be quite expensive if they have to fly in, for example. I always think that if you're going to face-to-face, you should leave that for a good row, as opposed to having it online, because you can only see their faces online. You can't see their body language. You haven't had a chat beforehand with coffee or afterwards. So you need to soak up all that stuff before you go into a boardroom to have a robust discussion, which is code for a row. In when you're looking at board minutes, a robust discussion took place. That means a row. So I think the hybrid, and it's still evolving, the hybrid board meeting as to how you use technology, how people prepare for it going forward, how the chair runs a hybrid board meeting, which is quite different from a face-to-face one, because you can see people, and if they're around it like a Zoom call like this, and you've 12 people on the screen, it's actually hard to know what's going on, what people think. And the first thing you need to make sure is they keep their cameras on, as opposed to, they vanish for 5 minutes for a cup of tea. That is not a good sign.
Yes.
So I think there's a lot of work to be done on that. We actually did a piece of research during COVID on board meetings and the evolution that one would go from having a physical board meeting to a hybrid board meeting over a period of time, and how you need to educate the board in itself in using technology. Because if you're suddenly going high tech and you have people of a certain age, I don't want to be ageist, they might struggle with the technology. How do I switch on my Zoom? How do I share documents? How do I send a message in chat or Q&A? All this sort of stuff. So there's a big training and education element here, and we do that in the diploma as well.
That's very interesting. Well, some of the work that we've been working on is corporate digital identity, which is this whole idea of the interoperability of a corporate identity in a global market that can handshake with other digital identities that exist, say, in Singapore or Estonia, for example. So the challenge of that is that then how do you manage that digital identity in a governance perspective? Who has access to that digital identity? And how is it used and governed within the organization in terms of cybersecurity, et cetera, et cetera? These are challenges.
Yeah, I think the big challenge, if you take corporate identities, just supposing you're going onto a board, what's its legal status? Does it have an identity? Where is it registered? And all these. Where is it a subsidiary of a holding company and wherever? So I think directors now, particularly with the Crime Act in the UK or which is coming through quite soon, directors now have to establish their identity with the organisation before they've been registered with Companies House down in Cardiff, and that's totally new. And the obligations now on companies to actually carry out due diligence on directors now is much increased, and rightly so. The the ability for nominee directors to turn up now, I think, is going to be much more difficult in the UK, which I think is good legislation. And particularly with the evolution of digital in the boardroom, digital everywhere, one needs a process or procedure and somebody within the organization who understands all this. It's probably going to be the company secretary, because a lot of stuff flows through him or her. And that's a role that is just not heralded enough, because it's such an important role.
That role of the company secretary is, in certain countries, that role is not even legislative a requirement to have a company secretary.
Well, if you compare the UK and Ireland, so we have a more recent Companies Act here, it's 2014. The board here must be of the view that if they appoint somebody to be company secretary, they must have the competence and experience to do so. There isn't the same in the UK, in their act, because it's a much older act, but I'm sure it will be updated in the new one. But you're right. Without a good co-sec, the trains won't run on time, basically, because they're responsible for collecting the information to go to the board pack, to get to the board, and making sure all the arrangements are appropriate. Particularly if you're, some multinationals might rotate their board meetings around the world. I know Accenture do, which is healthy, and they get a chance to meet the locals and things like that.
But I think it's with the aid of technology, if you're looking at rotating boards or board members around an organization, there needs to be some repository of information that they can call upon regardless of where they are, so that they can get up to speed very quickly.
Well, if they're a new director, they should go through an induction program. Assuming they've done their due diligence and they're happy to go to that process. Some directors will say, I'm happy to go on your board, but I want to attend the first board meeting before I commit, so that they're in an observer capacity, or maybe even 2 board meetings, depending on how well the first one went. And I'm seeing that a lot more, where people are saying, I just want to smell the air in the boardroom. And the classic kind of NED role is, it's kind of nose in, fingers out. They don't get involved in the operations of the business, but they need to be able to smell the air in the boardroom and the culture and all the rest of it. So the induction, which is generally not done that well, based on all the board reviews I've done, is getting them up to speed really quickly so they can participate in the meeting. I've come across really experienced NEDs who'll be chartered accountants. And in one in particular, he was on the board of a very, very large life assurance company. It said the induction was really poor. It took me 2 years actually to understand their business. That's 2 years sitting around a table, which is not good use of anybody's time. So the induction is critically important. And the other piece there that's really important is keeping people up to speed with ESG, digitization, cyber, which is a big thing at the moment. I was speaking at a conference for the FT in Lausanne a few weeks ago, and that was, 250 people from around the world. They were kind of cyber technologists trying to sort issues in various organizations. And the big challenge, a bit like IT 30 years ago, these people were not speaking the language of the boardroom. Yes. It was tech speak. So the boards didn't understand what they were saying. And I just said, well, you need an interpreter, basically. And I spent 20 minutes saying that, but it didn't take long. But what was fantastic was listening to the head of cybersecurity for the Ukraine, who was the keynote speaker. And he was saying, regardless of the war that's going on at the moment, the average payout for ransomware or cyber is €2,000. So many people pay the check to get rid of them.
Cheapers.
Yeah.
That's how important it is. I understand. And as important technologies today, there are various technologies, as you and I know, which is the disintermediation of between stakeholders, using various protocols, which are encrypted protocols, layers of truth and trust in a trustless environment, etc. These are all challenges for boards who have an average age where they really don't understand technology. How do you tackle that within a board in terms of decision making that needs to understand what the technology is going to be doing, and how technology will change the business structure and therefore the decision-making process around those businesses?
So I think the first thing to say there is you need to get the right people around the table. So if I'm looking at who should be around the table, I go to their business strategy. What skills is that suggesting? Mm-hmm. So post-COVID, the digitization of organizations has accelerated dramatically. I was about to launch a business in February 2020, which is selling a diploma in corporate governance, which is face-to-face. Yeah. Then I realized this ain't going to work. And then the Institute of Corporate Governance was developed online. I think you need probably younger people in the boardroom who are au fait with today's technology. There's a great example of a young lady in Australia. She was part of the Forbes 30 under 30, and Telstra, the big mobile phone company down there, asked her to go on their board because she was an innovator. She's 32, had developed and sold 2 or 3 tech companies, and they brought her onto the mobile phone company for her innovation capability. And she's the youngest person ever to go on a listed company in Australia. So she's bringing innovation and, I suppose, somebody who's kind of born on the internet into the boardroom. So it's highly unlikely you're going to get that with older age groups. They're going to struggle with the technology. So I think one needs to think quite broadly about who should be in the boardroom now, because it's not just for a certain age cohort. And the other thing is diversity. I mean, the great thing about our diploma, over 50% of people do it are women.
Fantastic.
And we're trying to, and women from different ethnic backgrounds too. It's not just all white, which is great. But we're trying to accelerate that. And, we have the chair of the Women on Boards Europe, who's also CEO of the International Banking Federation. And she's trying to educate 1,000 people to sit on boards of financial institutions around the world. That's our mission of Women on Boards in Europe, is a financial services focus. So we're trying to support organizations like that. And we also give a free place to a charity every month from France, the UK and Ireland, and that'll spread, trying to get basic corporate governance discipline. And they tend to be people from organizations that have no money, charities in particular, or nonprofits. So that's what we're trying to do. So one more so you have all these board portals, and the PLCs would use them and things like that, but they're a classic point of attack for anybody who wants to launch a cybersecurity attack on them, because it would just bring a lot of very confidential data out into the market quite quickly. Can you imagine Barclays Bank or JP Morgan that happening to? And I'm sure they've been attacked. So if you're on a board and you need to make sure that it is cybersecurity resilient, and whatever the next risk might be. There was a pandemic, now it's cyber, and there'll be something else coming down the road as well.
Absolutely. Well, with all the new technologies that we have available to us today, you're getting a situation where you actually mentioned it before, is to have the decision, have tools that are being used to support the decision-making process, and documents all in one place to solve the problem of leaking information by sending it via email, which is very insecure anyway. It's a very public space to send documents. But then you create an environment where all the intellectual property is resident in one place, which then puts it in a sort of centralized point, which can be easily attacked, because anybody with an email and a password can get in.
Yeah. I mean, I heard a discussion last week about cybersecurity attacks, and this person said that basically, if you're connected to the internet, you're open to an attack. That's it.
It comes with the territory. So one of the one things I wanted to bring is one of the most recent, I think, failures of corporate governance was in what I call new technology companies, in particular, a very large exchange that we all know about.
Yes.
It's obvious that with such a young group of people running a company, or one member having absolute control of the assets as well as the technology. Give us your the way that your view on that, in terms of with the structures that were put in place of foundations controlling some aspect of the technology, having some sort of fund that provides the liquidity to the autonomous organization and things like that. How does your approach to governance and also future governance evolve to actually make it better and incorporate all these new business models?
So what amazed me in relation to that exchange, and indeed for one or two other high-tech organizations in the US at the moment, is you have these really experienced investors putting in shed loads of money without doing any due diligence on processes, procedures, corporate governance. Is there a board there at all? And in the FTX case, it would appear that one person could write the checks, and these were huge checks. So, while one would lay the blame at his door, I would also lay the blame at the investor door. These are experienced investors who should have known better and done some sort of due diligence before they put the money in, or not, as the case may be. And if you're putting money into an organization of that scale, it was just enormous, and complexity. You'd want to make sure there's some basic corporate governance structures in place, like maybe an independent chair. There's a out of the box thought, maybe some independent non-exec directors, maybe appointed by some of the investors, to help this guy grow, and not be writing checks to buy houses for his mother, whatever he did. So I would think they should have been doing that first before they put the money in. I think just madness what they did. And the same with that lady in California with the blood test kit. And same thing, some very experienced investors put money in that, and now it's all gone.
Yes. I mean, you even going back pre the technology boom, go back to the Enron case. Another example of corporate governance failure.
Yeah, and the thing I always say to people is that you should never assume large, well-known brands have got good corporate governance. Mm-hmm. Your due diligence should be equally as concentrated as a small organization, because you've only one reputation as a non-exec director, and if you lose that, you're bunched. But perhaps it hasn't happened all the time, of course.
Absolutely. So, just putting your forward-looking, I mean, you're a bit of a visionary anyway in terms of what you're doing in terms of corporate governance. But if you sort of look forward, where would you like to see the impact of what you're doing in 5 years' time, and what impact that's going to have on companies, new companies in the future?
Well, the first thing we're trying to do is to make available a recognized diploma of corporate governance and ESG, which is accredited is the term that's used, globally online. So accessibility for people near the internet anyway, not everybody is. And that's the first thing. The other thing is we want to become the global standard for corporate governance. We want to be the global certifying body for anybody doing corporate governance. And we think that's doable, maybe the next 2 or 3 years, because we're producing such numbers into both diplomas. But more importantly, we want to be able to be an advocate for good governance in organizations, but also making sure the right people go on boards who've got a moral compass, which is important, good leadership skills, understand values, and understand culture. You get that right at the top of an organization, in the chair or the non-execs, you're in a good place. I mean, a really, this has been in the Guardian newspaper and the Times, a really poor example of an organization that didn't do their homework on doing some mining on the west coast of Australia last year or the year before. Rio Tinto, they bulldozed caves that were 46,000 years old and that were belonged to the indigenous people. They didn't know stakeholder impact or any work to see would anybody be offended. Now, good NEDs would kind of think about that. Now, they might have known about this, I don't know. But I mean, that's an example of appalling stakeholder management. And that's why good boards are good at that. It's not just the customers, it's the community, it's the government, it's the staff, it's their suppliers and all that type of stuff. And now it's the environment and now it's people. So, I live in the EU, which is a very privileged place to live compared to a lot of other countries around the world. But now goods can be stopped at the border here if there's any issues over the integrity or the authenticity or the conditions of the workers who made those goods in other countries. So that's coming in, I think, in the 1st of Jan.
Yes.
So, and you see this, where clothes are sold for half nothing in a supermarket place. You wonder how they produce it. And, we see factories going up in smoke in Asia sometimes because the people aren't. They tend to be women in poor working conditions and not looked after. We actually saw the same in Leicester 2 years ago with Boohoo, a major online retailer, and they had over 400 local contractors making clothes for them. And these are women working for less than minimum wage in really unsafe buildings, and they were found out. And that didn't do their corporate governance or their reputation much good.
David, this has been a very, very interesting hour that we spent together. And thank you very much for enlightening us and our audience on the way forward in terms of corporate governance, how to put businesses together and the decision-making process of businesses, particularly looking at the new way in which we bring in metrics like ESG, which is environmental, social, and the G bit that you do. And obviously developing the resilience of companies in the context of that and the reporting. But it's been very, very exciting time I spent and learned a lot from you today. Thank you very, very much. But if anybody wants to get in touch with you at the Corporate Governance Institute, what's the best way in which they can do that?
Just Google our name, the Corporate Governance Institute. And it's there.
They can contact you and they can contribute and they can participate in potential courses.
Yeah, I mean, we run webinars every 2 weeks to try and educate people who want to listen to us. I did one from Dubai 2 weeks ago on the big trends in 2020 and what the focus might be in 2023. And we'd kind of people there from the US, the Middle East, and the Netherlands giving us their views on what they saw. So 3 different continents. That was interesting. So we run these on a regular basis just to educate. And it's a lead generator as well, obviously. But we're always looking for people who have an interest in interacting with us. So we have a huge community that we're building globally of people who have an interest in not just corporate governance or corporate governance sake, but that's the impact it should have on communities, on businesses, and on countries. I mean, in 2015, the FT identified bad corporate governance as one of the ways that the world might end. And they said, for that to happen, you need a global dictator. Unlikely to happen, but we've seen some political systems of late which have gone partly that direction, which would worry you at times. But that kind of caught my attention in 2015.
How interesting. David, thank you very much. And thank you very much for viewing and engaging in today's podcast. To my audience, if you're interested in knowing more about citiesabc.com with openbusinesscouncil.org and Fashion ABC, do go to our platforms as well, as you can find me, Hilton Supra, on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram. And do go to the other interviews we have done on YouTube. And don't forget to like and comment. Thank you very much for your time today and engaging with this interview with David Duffy on Cities ABC. Thank you, David.
Thank you very much.